consistency of action. Consistent behaviour. How great minds think alike. How about yourself? Communication, yeah, brilliant.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing of following up on actions instead of just saying them, and being consistent with those actions instead of just being that is what's being said and not being followed up on.
Yeah, so being consistent.
Following the established rules.
Okay, so that, I guess that's interesting. So we had following of established rules. So that is an overlap in a few different ones. So that's about boundaries, I suppose. But it's also about understanding, isn't it? An understanding of etiquette. And how do we follow consistent rules if we don't know what the rules are? That's really interesting. So an ability to interpret and intuit the rules, or to have had clear communication about what those rules are, and then to be able to follow them. So, yeah.
I think for me, active and enthusiastic participation.
Okay, so active, enthusiastic participation in learning. Hopefully that's a bit of what we're all doing right here. That's kind of my hope. But I guess as well, what makes us trustworthy, it is the ability to be able to reflect on, some of the practice that I have in terms of what I might do or I think is acceptable now might be very different to what I thought was acceptable 15 years ago, and that might be partly because I've grown, but also it might be about what's appropriate and what's okay. And I don't know if anybody, very, very, a bit of a side thing, but This Is Gonna Hurt is a brilliant series on BBC iPlayer at the moment, and one of the lead actors in that was part of something called the Amateur Anaesthetists, and they did some songs that were very, very close to the wire, and people are trying to cancel that right now because of some of the things that were produced. And what we're doing is we're making a judgment on that human being based on what is okay to produce now versus what was culturally appropriate to produce 15 years ago. And I think that's very different. So lifelong learning is about you as an individual, but also keeping up with the trends of society. And that can be difficult. Something somebody asked me today was, there's a lot of new people here who are quite young. This has been always young. And it's like, well, that's changed. So things change. Are we untrustworthy if we don't keep up with the trend and keep up with changes? That's interesting, isn't it? That's a right in there all of its own. Anyway, next one. Oh, there's always one who wants to.
Person's knowledge and people's question.
Okay.
The other one's very important, just equal hygiene.
So hygiene impacts on your ability to trust somebody?
Yeah, because if you're in this shaped blood play with somebody, and they don't know about cross-contamination and cleanliness,
Okay, okay, no, that's good. And what was the other one, sorry?
Well, yeah, no, it's the person's knowledge of the subject. It's a good way to judge somebody.
Okay. So that's really interesting. So somebody's knowledge, we've gone back to that, having proficiency. So do we not trust somebody if somebody says, I don't know? I actually don't know that. Let me find that out for you. Let me learn. Can we learn together? How do we develop? I'm not saying we're not right, but ultimately I think it takes a certain sort of person to be able to say, let me just stop there, I'm not sure.
That was all where I was going.
Yeah, so that's, so thank you for that. Listening, so an ability to be able to listen, and that's really interesting. So many people have said communication, and I'm really pleased that it's been mentioned a few times, but I go back to a really simple kind of statement that my absolute fondest person, my grandmother used to always say. She said, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I think when it comes to communication, I don't know why she say that to me, no idea. But anyway, when it comes to communication, ultimately, we're very, very focused on what we produce, the output, and quite often, are we listening to understand, or are we listening to respond? And I think when it comes certainly to relationships, building dynamics, we need to understand. We need to understand what the expectations are. So I think listening is really, really important. And it's important to highlight that as its own entity in communication. Oh, save the best for last. This is my daddy, for anyone who doesn't know, my husband. So if there is any kind of banter here, that's why. So what makes somebody trustworthy?
Congruence.
He's brilliant. So he's not come up with that. So what do you mean by congruence for everybody else?
So congruence is that essentially there is one single word is people's words and actions are in complete alignment. And that comes from observation and a degree of intuition.
So he wants more than one, but wants to pretend that he doesn't want more than one. He's just going to say one word, and it's going to mean 6 different things. That's his all. However, ultimately, what we're saying there is authenticity. You know, are we consistently who we present, who we say we are? Have we got integrity? Is that there all of the time? And what do we mean by consistency? Because we're not all consistent. I can assure you that I have my off days. I am not consistently the wonderful human being that I purport to be. So how does that impact a relationship? What happens when we lose that ability to be consistent? When we're grieving, when we've lost our job, when things aren't great, when we're having an off day? How does that impact a relationship, and how ultimately do we manage that? And that was a good set of examples. I think what she's done. That's it, sorry. I didn't do you now.
Oh,
No. You have to go to what makes somebody.
I've got another one if you want on my list.
For me, it's the difficult part of expressing a whole bunch of things that all wrapping together. Quite early on in my career, when I didn't do all this kink stuff, I was active in science and business and investment. So one of my jobs was actually due diligence and looking at things, and the more you look into it, does it actually still add up? Because it's fine for someone to say, hey, wow, I do this and I can do this and I've done that, but actually, is there that proof that provides the foundation to support what's being said? Because so often, particularly in a business context, I'm using, oh yeah, we've got this great, amazing drug candidate and we're going to cure cancer. Now, I heard that an awful lot in the 90s, because every biotech company was coming up with that spin. And the reality is, it's technically impossible, because you're saying cancer, and it's completely different for treating pancreatic cancer, to lung cancer, to brain cancer. They're all different. And therefore, to me, there are sometimes things that people say that you then have to really look in to support what they're saying, and that's what builds trust with me.
And I've known him a long time, and I had absolute trust and faith that I would not get a one-word answer. So I guess Jerry came in, and we missed Jerry, wasn't there at the start. Do you want everyone's given us a word in terms of what for them makes somebody trustworthy, and you want to join in?
Makes someone trustworthy?
Yeah, what makes you trust somebody? What's the thing that if you're making an assessment about whether somebody is trustworthy for you, and in a word, what word would be the most important?
Honesty, truthfulness.
Honesty, yeah, we've heard that last week.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
is someone being straight with me? If they're enjoying something, are they saying so? If they're not enjoying it, are they saying so? Are they listening to what I'm saying? I spent many, many years of my life lying to myself and lying to my family and friends about being kinky. And for the past 7 years, I don't lie anymore. It's great, and that's what I say to everybody. That's the most important thing. If it works for you, say so. If it doesn't work for you, say that as well.
and I think
Don't continue with any kind of scene that isn't working.
And I think we've had honesty mentioned a few times, and I think thank you for that answer. And I think ultimately what Jerry's talking about there is interactions in a play space, or the truth to yourself, living your truth. But that's interesting, isn't it? So honesty. So whose truth are we talking about there? You know, we're talking about relationships here in this set. We're talking about establishing relationships. My truth, my perception, my opinion of a situation, how I've come to that determination might be completely different to somebody else's truth. And when you work with relationships, that's, you know, it's building that bridge between each person's truth. Where does the compromise go? So that's really, really interesting. How do we even decide what's true? What's true for us, what's true for the other person? And I think I've got something like down here. And Boxman is somebody who writes about this subject in terms of relationship work, and somebody who I have a great deal of time and respect for. And how they define trust is a confident engagement with the unknown. When things go wrong or go right, I'll still be okay. So that's really interesting. So what that statement is saying is that when we are building relationships with other people, and we're thinking, okay, do we trust them? Do they exhibit all of these characteristics that we've had around the room? That's great, but what about us? What about our relationship with ourselves? Because ultimately, sometimes trust is that, well, I will be okay. If I form an attachment with this human being and that goes awry, I will be okay. Now you can do all your due diligence and all your checks and everything in the world, and I have permission to mention this story, by the way, but I was working with somebody recently and they were forming an attachment with someone, they were building trust, they were having a great time, they were doing absolutely everything right, that relationship was going somewhere, and then a curveball came along. Somebody came along and said, I'm 21 months pregnant with your child. What can we do about that? We absolutely cannot do anything about that. We could have done all the diligence and the checks in the world, and sometimes life just is shit. So that relationship, that trusting relationship, starts with you. Do you trust yourself to be okay? Do you trust yourself to be able to form relationships, to communicate, to do due diligence, to be able to be, thank you, Joe, be honest about what it is you truly want and not be living the lie for a long period of time? Are you authentic? Are we displaying these characteristics that we expect from the other person? Because if the answer is no, then for me, you're not fulfilling Boxman's definition of trust. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. So that's the first thing.
I'm also going to say at that stage, it's also very activity-based, independent. So there is a level of trust that you need to transfer and build. For example, if you've met someone and you're going to have a mild light spanking on the spanking bench that night, that's a different level that you need to get to, well, hey, if you're going to have a bath full of ice and you maybe minus a kink at the end of it.
And that's the thing with trust as well. We were talking about. So we were talking about trust earlier on, and I was saying, I'm married to you, I love you, you do lots of things to me, they're fabulous, I trust you. Personal disclosure here, sorry, TMI, I'm on the waiting list for a hysterectomy 2 years. 2 years I've got to wait. Do I trust him to take my womb out? No, we do medical play, but that might be a little bit too far.
I was going to say, I'm an amateur gynecologist at best. So probably, do I trust him to do a hysterectomy? No. So that, ultimately I'm going to see that. But the point is, this is not a linear concept. This is not, I trust you, or I do not trust you. If we're talking about capacity, yet many years ago, when I was new to clinical work, someone had capacity, and they didn't have capacity. Nowadays, it's a far more complex thing than that. Capacity for what decision? Do we trust somebody to do what? I absolutely trust this human being to do lots of things. Are there certain things I wouldn't trust him with? If I'm really honest, yeah, they are. And I'm absolutely sure that would go
I wouldn't trust myself with something.
Exactly. And that works both ways. I'm sure he would say the same about me. So that's really, really, really important. What are we talking about here? And I think ultimately as well, what are the implications when it comes to BDSM and relationships? So who in the room, show of hands, sorry, I've been mean again, who in the room thinks that you have to have a greater level and degree of trust to engage in and to have and to, have an effective relationship that has a dynamic? So be it, DDLG, have to have more trust. Oh, this is really awful because this is where I lose the entire fucking room. So I'm really sorry, you're all welcome to go out now, but I disagree with that. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think all relationships, I think all relationships require the same degree of trust. I really, really do. And I think we have this misnomer within the BDSM community, within the scene, that what we do requires more trust. And I think that's really interesting because you either trust somebody or you don't trust somebody. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure whether in other loving relationships or other interpersonal relationships that's any different. And everybody's free to disagree with me. I know that that's my position.
I know that that's a position of other people who I really respect. Some people say that's not what I think, that's not my view, and I'm okay with that. I'm honestly all right with that.
I think the perception is that there has to be a greater level of trust because of the activities that we engage in. So because they're perceived as being extracurricular to a normal or vanilla relationship, that there must automatically be a higher level. And I think there is trust to certain activities, but I agree with you to the principle of actually it needs to be the same fundamental foundation level of trust to build any relationship.
Absolutely, and I have young people, I would say, yeah. Now, those were forged in a relationship that wasn't particularly DS heavy. I have to co-parent with somebody for the rest of my days. The trust that I require to do that, to be able to do that, is that completely different? But is that any different to, ultimately being in a caregiving relationship with somebody? We require high levels of trust in any interpersonal relationship we have, where we're having a committed, long-term relationship with somebody, where we are putting our vulnerability and, to a degree, some of our okayness into their hands. That requires the same, regardless of who's involved in it. And I really, really feel that really strongly. And it's why. Why is that important? Because ultimately what trust does, when we feel that we are trusted, and when we trust another human being, it creates oxytocin. So for people who don't know what oxytocin is, that's our love drug. So for any relationship, when I'm doing couples work, whether I'm working with vanilla couples, I'm working with BDSM couples, I'm working with polycules, I'm working with people who are in MS relationships, and they're absolutely controlled 24/7. All of those relationships to thrive require oxytocin. They absolutely do. For us to have that hit, what drives us towards a loving, committed relationship is oxytocin. And what happens is that's how it's created. When we are trusted, creates them. That takes us to our happy place. It makes us okay. So ultimately, if we want to have DS relationships that are healthy, that have longevity, that everybody's getting what they need from it, there needs to be that oxytocin flowing freely both ways. And what creates that? Things like consistency, things like everything that we said in the movie. We all went around, we all know what creates an environment where oxytocin can grow and it can flourish. And that's really, really important. Really important because it's easy to establish a relationship, easy new relationship energy, everything that says this seed is here, I'm going to plant it, I'm attracted to you, my God, you're fucking hot, look at that latex you're wearing, you're the best figure that I've ever seen, you're going to hand me up in this position and you're going to stick that box between my legs and we're going to have a great time. We can all do that, or we can, we can be around that, but how does that oak grow? That's how we have a seed. And some people, that's all they want. Some people do not want to develop that relationship into something with longevity, something with a dynamic in a long-term attachment. But that's what we're talking about today. So we have to water that seed with everything that we went around the room with for that to grow. And we have to consistently do that. My God, it's no wonder I'm busy. It's no wonder that, in more than 50% of marriages end in divorce now. It's no wonder we make a living. It sounds like fucking hard work. And then what happens when that's broken? And then what do we do ultimately when that trust's broken? And that's another workshop in itself. But when that trust is broken, when we fuck up, what do? When we go around the room again and we do all of those things again, we're honest. We say, why did you fuck up? Why did this happen? Let's communicate it. Let's pull it apart. Let's do a radar. Let's have a meeting. Let's try and reconnect. Reconnect is so important. Let's be really honest with ourselves. Let's try again. Let's start to try and be consistent. Let's try and start and be congruent. Let's accept that we're all human beings and we know what we fucked up. That's really, really important. And about setting those expectations for love. What does this mean to us? Somebody comes to me and says, I want a 24/7 DS relationship. What does that mean? What does that mean to you versus what does that mean to me? It means completely different things. So we have to go around and we have to do this. We have to do this regularly. So to build a relationship with DS, when we say, do you need a greater level of trust? Do you need a greater level of communication skills? Do you need? I would say no. But we do need that regularly. I'm all for clinical supervision in the workplace. I'm all for things like that. Relationship supervision. I was in a session the other day, a couple session, and I coined the term, what are the relationship KPIs? Now, for anyone who doesn't know what they are, key performance indicators. What means we're doing a good job, right? If you're in a relationship with somebody and you want to be able to trust them to give you what you need to know what your KPIs are. If somebody's saying to you, right, I want you to run this service, and I'm going to determine whether it's a success or whether it's a failure, and you don't tell me what the KPIs are, it's going to be a fucking failure. It's not a mind reader. So if you can't tell somebody what are your relationship KPIs, then what are you working towards? What are our relationship KPIs?
Well, I think
you have to supply dogs on a regular basis.
Oh no, I was going to say it's just like demonstrate consistency, emotional intelligence, accountability, communication. To be fair, we talked about this just before we came in, so I'm a ringer,
You are, you buy me 2 minutes, keep going, you're great.
But it's, I was going to say, it's that internal, sort of like that happiness and that providing space. We talked about kind of Poppy's daddy, that DDLG, that holding a space. And I know full well what that looks like, that level of support that's needed to enable that. And so it's actually a KPI. I think, well, how often does that occur? How does that occur? Does that happen? Did it happen successfully? And it sounds like we have very, in-depth conversation at the kitchen events, but it's not. It's more case of there's a degree of intuition, observation, feedback. Am I done?
2 minutes, well wasted.
No.
Bullshitting at speed is part of my job.
But I think also one of the other misnomers within the Kpis. So I'm gonna have two contentious things now off the top of that. But I think ultimately when it comes to trust and when it comes to building trust, what we tend to believe is that there is a dynamic there, there's a power imbalance in terms of it's far more important for the top to be trustworthy. It's far more important for them to be proficient, for them to be able to initiate and do the conversations, for them to be accountable. It's so important to be accountable as a top, for them to be all of the things that we've said around this room. I don't believe that. So ultimately, this is about equality. You have exactly the same amount of responsibility and expectation based upon you, regardless of what side of the slash that you're on. Any slash, I don't care what kind of relationship dynamic you're trying to build. There's a myriad of them to choose from, but it matters both ways. And that's another bee in my bonnet that I have about this, that sometimes we don't realise that we're as equally culpable as one another. So I think it's about if you are building a relationship with a very strong dynamic, you're using the obedience, you're using, you've got an MS relationship on the go. We're looking at TA, we're looking at, the importance of, how much time somebody spends in child versus how much they spend in adult. They still have a responsibility to submit their KPIs, to do the talking, to do the, the learning, the lifelong learning. That's really, really important. So how are you going to factor that into the relationship? If somebody spends 90% of their time within a DS dynamic, sat at your feet, not allowed to talk, or they're, DDLG and they're in a nappy or whatever, they're asking permission for everything, it's absolutely fine, by the way. There's no king shaming here for me in any of these dynamics. But how are you going to factor in the other things that need to happen? Because they do need to happen. So do we have timeouts? Do we go for walk? Do we have a day where there's not a dynamic? Do I give you permission to speak if you're sat here and we're equals and this reflects that? Do I take your collar off you once a week? Do I, what does that look like? Can I give you free feedback and opinion? We talked about feedback, but I've got to say, Sir Danny, can I have permission to speak first? I don't mind what you do, but all of these things need consideration about how am I going to fulfill all of these obligations. My God, there's loads of them, weren't there? How am I going to fulfill those in the dynamic of which I'm living in? And that is everybody's responsibility. It doesn't matter what dynamic you have.
I'm going to be slightly controversial here and say, if someone very publicly shouts they should have known better than they would have gone, I'm expecting to hear that on a semi-regular basis. Either once every 6 months, once every 12 months, depends on how frequently they change their relationship. Because, again, it's that not accepting your own role in the trust and risk equation, and that in itself is dangerous because what we do is risky. Okay, accidents do and will occur. The more risky the activity you get in, the greater the risk of that occurring. And yet, there's this perception that has been pervasive for probably the last 50, 60 years that it is the top or Dom's responsibility, full stop. And actually, kind of always takes two to tango.
And I think, it depends on what people want from this workshop, but we could be really psychologically heavy. We could talk about Erickson. We could talk about trust versus mistrust. We could talk about how we as infants ultimately determine whether somebody's trustworthy or wheted they're not. King's not doing this workshop, but some of this stuff is lifted from my kids that they've done it. I've spoken to them about that before this workshop. But what they do say, and what they have said in things that they've done before, is that when you have people in an orphanage, you have babies in an orphanage, and they are neglected, they do not meet these stages of Erickson's development, the damage to that is far more than children and infants who actually have actual harm occurred to them, be it physical abuse, be it sexual abuse. So neglect is so important. So from a psychological point of view, you do not go through these phases, trust versus mistrust. You do not have an infanthood as a tiny baby where you attach yourself and you learn to trust your caregiver and you learn to identify what's safe and what's not safe, what's okay, what's not okay. And then you go through adolescence and then you rebel and then you're an absolute twat or anything like me, and then you push the boundaries and then that reinforces, oh, what does that happen? If you've had neglect in your adolescence and you get to the stage of being a young person or being an adult, you've not gone through that process, you are going to have difficulties making an assessment about whether you trust another human being. Now, I'm really sorry, but that is just fact. The more trauma and the first experiences you have, the more difficult it is for us to determine if somebody is trustworthy. If you can't trust your own judgment because of what you have experienced in whatever stage of life you're in, then what are you going to do about that? And that's really contentious, and I'm sorry if that upsets anybody. But that responsibility, that accountability is there. We all have reasons why we really struggle to make a judgment call. And if that applies to you, that's okay. It applies to a lot of us. But then what? What are we going to do? Thank you very much. And what I say is we're not responsible for the hand of cards that we are dealt, but we are responsible for how we play them. And it's exactly what you've just said there, so thank you. And it's about remembering that. And that again, that is not slash dependent, it's not relationship dependent, it's not anything dependent. It's how we go about being a healthy, well-adjusted human being in any community. And I think that's really, really important. Yeah.
To extract on the point you were making just there on how we learn to bond as we develop, well, actually, a new relationship is kind of the same thing. So you've got to build that trust as step by step as you go through it. And one of the things I would point out at that stage is we all learn gradually. So learn the basics about each other and establish that foundation before you start going, right, okay, next week it's going to be fresh hook suspensions from your little toe on the ceiling, and I'm going to be flogging you and using a violent wand at the same time. That isn't a good recipe for trust. You might want to go, okay, we're going to do a lot of discussion, and then we're going to do some gentle play. Because some people, if you're new into it or new into a relationship, there is that risk that it's not quite right and you haven't worked it out yet. And you don't want that buyer's remorse to be around, oh my God, I love the fresh hook suspension from the ceiling, but the flogging in the wand was too much. Okay? Start small, build things, and be sensible in how you do it. There is nothing wrong with, I've been on the scene actively 20 odd years, I've been kinky, or known I've been kinky since the age of 5. Last thing I'm going to do is meet someone and rush straight into doing something that's extreme, because there is that risk that the person's going to go, yeah, no, that wasn't what I was looking for. That will make me feel bad because I didn't read the situation properly. I trust myself to avoid those in the first place.
Did anybody, because I'm aware that this is a workshop that was asked for as well, so I guess for me it's about, I don't know if the person asking that is here, if they are, please make themselves known, but we all came into this workshop with an expectation, and I want to know whether that expectation's been met in terms of how we talked about trust with relationships. Was there a specific question in terms of type of relationship, or what motivated that? So has anybody got anything they'd like to add in terms of what they were hoping to get from this, and whether that what we said has addressed that?
I guess a question I'd have is, are there any pointers you'd give for the types of either relationships or kinks or fetishes that are a bit more extreme, and you want to broach that topic either with someone you've been with already or someone who is in the scene, but like a thing like this, for example, if you had something you were interested in and you met somebody you knew they were interested in things, how would you start to enter into a conversation about either like CNC or blood play or the types of things that are a little more extreme?
Yeah. So you talking about in an established relationship? Or?
Yeah, well, either I suppose.
Okay. So
either.
Yeah, so I guess for me it goes back to what I was talking about. I'm all about transparency from the off. That's really important. There's no point establishing a relationship with somebody that's based on, I don't know, rope bondage, and then saying, well, in actual fact my real kink is this, and that's on their hard limit list. So if you look at my profile, or you talk to people about me, or you look at me, I'm quite open and honest about what I like. So I advocate people to be able to do that. So that transparency from the off is really important. But obviously that expectation that, this is what I like. I am working towards finding a 24/7 MS relationship. That's what I would like. I have got a daddy here. I said I've got a daddy, I've got a partner, we're married nowadays. When I met him, I said, I've had an MS relationship in the past. I don't feel in my current situation, with all the responsibilities in the life that I live, I can have an MS relationship. It doesn't fit, it's incongruent. Said congruence is so important. Is he aware that, when we're in our retirement, I might like our dynamic to be slightly different to what it is now? I should hope so. We've had those conversations, he knows, but this is what I can give you now. That's a really extreme example. I want to marry somebody and I might want to change the relationship dynamic when I don't have the responsibilities that I've got. What you're talking about is similar. I want something to be a shared goal, we're going to work towards it. But how are you going to get that? But ultimately, you're going to get that by finding somebody who has that interest, and then those conversations need to happen early. Are you interested in being my slave? Are you interested in blood play? Do you want to do this? Do you want to have a bone broken? The answer might be yes. You're not going to do that on the first date. So how are you going to work towards that? And it's going to be the demonstration of everything we spoke about. But also, it's going to be about, I will explain that.
We had to invoke that.
It is going to be about producing oxytocin. So I'm going to be consistent. I'm going to feed your love language in whatever way I'm going to feed it. You're going to trust me. I'm going to trust you. We're going to trust ourselves more. With that comes a production of noradrenaline. When we have lots of oxytocin and we feel really, really like we love somebody and we trust them and we want to be with them, our sexuality, our sex drive increases. But for lots of people, that means their submissiveness increases. That might mean their dominance increases. Whatever it is that your genitals affiliate sexuality, that increases. So with that, you ride that roller coaster. And you're on an uphill roll, aren't you? Well, then I can do that, and then I can do that, and then something happens because fucking life. And then trust breaks. And it's like, oh my God, I thought you were the one I was going to run off the sunset with, but you can't put the fucking toilet seat down. And I can't trust you to put the toilet seat down, even though I've asked you several times, and you promised me you would put the toilet seat down.
Toilet seat down.
And you said it, now I don't trust you anymore, I do what you say. And then you work through that, and then you re-establish that, and then you build it. And then eventually you get to the point where you say, do you know what, we both have a real interest in this. Are we there now? And then you do that. And that's how it works. Ultimately, what I will say is, and I say this all the time, it's like cooking. You can always add more salt. You can't take it away. So if you fucking ruin the soup, you ruin the soup. So you've got to add that salt in a relationship.
One point I would say, if you haven't come across it, there is a thing called a map of the lands of human sexuality. Now, in this particular case, you find by looking at that map and its geography that certain groups of activities sit together. So if you're into the more extreme stuff, that's all kind of connected in one Venn area. So don't necessarily be talking to rope bondage people about blood flow, because they're just things that don't overlap and connect. So if you are looking at those areas, then you want to find the tribe of people who are into those activities, because that's where you will find your match, if that makes sense. Whereas taking someone in who says, oh, I'm just really new into this, I'm exploring, I've read 50 Shades, I'm a bit interested, then you probably don't want to be talking to them about ritualistic scarification. However, someone who comes up and goes, I'm really new into this, and you're looking and thinking, I can count 15 piercings in your rings or in your ears, and it looks like you have several others in other places. Well, that's a person who has already illustrated that they are into that kind of ritualistic and pain and endorphin release, and if they've got tattoos as well on top, then those are more likely to be potential tribe members for you in those activities than hey, I really like doing colouring in.
But congruence, though, is so important. You know, I might say, you know, I'm into DS. If your first message to me is, you want to be a slave, get on your fucking knees, I'm going to think you're a dickhead. You know, I really like some of the things you've said. I love blood play, I'm quite known for blood play, it's what I do. If the first message you send me is in relation to blood play, we ain't going to be doing blood play, because I'm going to think, oh my god, I'm not okay with that. So it's about congruence. If you come to me and say, I really like to get to know you, listen to you talk, this, you know, what, this is what I'm into, can we talk about that, can we chat about that? That's where things go, and that's what I mean about, you know, so there's one thing about finding your tribe, but there's another about being a congruent human being who establishes a relationship and gets it to where it needs to go, and that's the difference. Because how many of us say, you know what, I'm into DS, and then we get a message that's, you know, I'm going to collar you. What, are you going to collar me tomorrow just because I'm a submissive woman and I want to be in a relationship where I'm owned? I don't think you are. We still can't skip the going around the room, you know?
I was going to say, how many 5-hour coffee dates did we have before we approached the idea of doing anything? Like, how much sounding out one another was there?
There was a lot of sounding out before there was any sounding. We can I assure you, we can talk. And I think that's really, really important. And if you can't talk, that's okay too. How are you going to communicate? What is your preferred method? Are you going to write a diary for somebody? Are you going to have, you know, protracted messages online? How are you going to communicate? You know, you don't have to be able to talk. What does that look like? Did anybody else have any questions about trust and specific relationships, or anybody who wanted this workshop or asked for this workshop that they would like to ask? No?
I'd just like to add that
there's one back here.
Being trusted is one of the greatest things in the world.
Yeah, that's what I said. So that produces, so in the same way that trusting somebody and that being well, that being trusted. So that's why dynamics work so well, because it's that two ways, isn't it? If you are trusted to look after me or to care for me or to even do something
when you're
fucking vile to me, so that's what happens. It's that relationship that keeps together really tight, or any kind of dynamic tight. Because if you trust somebody, you submit to them, you know, they ultimately, they want more sex, they want more play, they want that. This is why we get into that thing in the early days when we've got new relationship energy, where, you know, it's all that, you know, fucking and loving and great and playing, and how do we keep that? And it's not, you know, it's not realistic to keep it there all the time, but you want to, you know, we want to maintain a relationship. But it's that, you know, it's that two-way. It's really, really important. And interesting, for people who are interested, when you don't trust somebody, so when you have conflict with somebody, when they don't put the toilet seat down and you have to challenge them about it, what does that do for human beings? And it does very different things in people who were born male versus people who were born female. And if you're transitioning or if gender isn't something that's very, you know, binary, then that's something to be aware of, how that impacts you. But men, when they don't feel trusted, when you do not trust a man, what happens is he can then become more aggressive. The hormones are released that ultimately purport
conflict. Whereas for women, it's very, very different. Cis-born women are talking about. So what happens when you are having a disagreement because something hasn't gone right? How are you going to respond and what are you going to need when that trust breaks down? That's different too. So that's a really important point. But if we can keep it where we're both trusting each other and everything's great, good luck if it's going to keep it there all of the time. Please don't, every relationship therapist in the whole country will get out of business. But if you can keep it where it's like that all of the time, then ultimately you're not going to have those situations. I think you were going to ask me something.
Yeah, I was just to go back to the last point, all that messages. I've had so many guys, as you've been saying, interacting with them, talking to them, and it gets to the point of being seen, I said, do you want to be for a coffee or a drink? And I'm like, yeah. And they're always like, okay, talking to hotel with them, I'm like, well, no, it's just coffee, it's just a drink.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's always going to be for the next trip, or I want to get to know you as a person. I understand why people find that so massively hard.
Well, I mean, the reason why people find that so massively hard is because ultimately we're in we really like as human beings instant gratification. And a lot of us, some of us more than others, are constantly chasing dopamine. And we all try and chase dopamine for different reasons. Some of us chase dopamine because we're deficient in it, because we've got ADHD. Some of us are chasing it because they really don't feel good about themselves and they're depressed and they're low. That we all chase these things for different reasons. And ultimately we've got to the stage where it's socially acceptable to do that. We've got apps like, Grindr, where we're going to hook up and we're going to fuck, and that's okay. And you know what? That is okay. That's okay.
When it's mentioned from the start that it is just going to be coffee or it is just going to be for a drink, nothing else is going to happen.
Exactly. And then you have no trust in that individual then, because what you have done is you have set a boundary. For some people, some of the time that's okay, and that's fine. But for me, this is my boundary, and the boundary is that love heart you draw around yourself. And you said, I want a coffee. I don't want a fuck, I just want a coffee. And if somebody can't respect that, and somebody says, well, even though you've been very clear saying you want a coffee, I want to hit the dopamine, so fuck you, my hit the dopamine is more important than your boundary, there's no trust. Yeah. And that's it, it's as simple as that. And that's the decisions that we make when we're deciding, are we going to meet somebody for coffee, are we going to, but the dopamine chasing is okay if you're meeting another dopamine chaser. You're not going to, but what is somebody expressing to you? What are they communicating? And what is their boundary? And we're back to what builds trust. You've got to have 2 ears and 1 mouth. That person hasn't got 2 ears. They're not hearing you say, well, I only want a caramel latte, thank you. So.
And actually, to me, that's probably the most important tool that you can have in building trust, is a blank piece of paper. Because you both map out and plan what you want to do together on that piece of paper. And that way, in your example, hey, this is my flow, this is where I want to go, this is my structure. And they've kind of gone, yeah, but my structure is I want to go straight from, we've had 3 conversations, now I want to book a hotel. Yeah, and it's like, actually, you started off on the right page and you were following the right things, but then actually the trust was broken because you were on different structures. Now, I think it's right. You couldn't have expressed yourself in a way where that person would have heard what you wanted, because for them it was all about what they wanted. Yeah? They made that decision before you got to that place, and their needs and requirements were the priority rather than yours. So that's not built trust in both of you. They've got to the stage of going, yeah, I'm happy, I've got the level of trust for a hotel meetup, but actually you weren't on the same page as that.
And I just ignore those people now, but in actual fact it's really nice because at least they show their hand really early. It's like, you know what, I've discounted you from the off, and it gets disheartening when you repeatedly.
Yeah, that's the same, because after like the fourth or the 5th one, kind of like is this. I've not been changed. Whatever you want to do, that's absolutely. I'm happy with that. But it's just like after I was 6 to 10, you just kind of think that I'm just wasting my time, basically.
It's really hard, and I think lots of people feel like that lots of the time. And it is, and ultimately, it's how do you respond to that? How do you be okay with that? And I'm just often reminded. I'm okay with that because I think, do you know what? I've had experiences in the past where it's taken me a long time to realise somebody's not trustworthy. Thank you for showing your hand so early and not wasting my time. But that gets very monotonous and it's very disheartening, and I completely understand that.
But on the flip side of that, I'm going to say that things that are rare and rarefied and special don't come along every day. It's as simple as that. So you do have to have all the conversations with people where they're not seeing what you want from it. And therefore, I might have 99 of those before I consider having a more detailed conversation with someone and progressing and taking it forward. So I know the world should be more equitable, and for the effort you put in, you should get more of a response. But I think in this area, it's one of those where resilience is massively important, because if you're holding those boundaries, you're looking for something specific. The more specific, the longer it's going to take you to find.
And I think that's one of the things that can be really difficult, that waiting for what it is that you're looking to come along. And I get that, you know. And I think, what do we do with that? And that's a very personal thing. But I'm going back to, you know, what I will end this on is about that relationship and that trust we have in ourselves. I trust that what is meant for me and the person for me will find me. I trust that I will be okay. I have trust in myself. What I will do is I'm going to make sure that I work on all of these for me. I'm going to make sure that I can communicate, that I know what I want. I've got the kids who talk about that Haynes user manual. I'm going to stick with relationship KPIs. I really like that. But I know what my key performance indicators are in a relationship. When it's there, when it presents itself to me, I'm going to be ready for it. And do you know what? I might do some other things that I quite enjoy that are a little bit transient, you know, because I enjoy them. I might have a few casual scenes. I'm really into that. You know, I fetishize this, so I'm going to find somebody that I can do this with. But I'm going to be very clear that's what this is, and then maybe the rest will come. And not everybody can do that for lots of different reasons, and I get that. But if you are ultimately, you know, you have a very specific relationship that you want, you know, we're all looking for something. And when you dilute that down, and ultimately you are saying, you know, if you want a 24/7 MS relationship with a daddy dog, you know, and you're going into Wetherspoons, the chances of finding that, if it's not, you know, a Lanchester weekend held in a Wetherspoons, is really slim, isn't it?
Just for the record, there will never be held in a fucking Wetherspoons. Not a stop. I have standards. And you all give me a certain level of trust.
Well, you know, if you're looking for a niche within a niche within a niche, it's going to be difficult. So what are we going to do about that whilst we, you know, there are things you can do to make, you know, I talk a lot about Marshall Linham, I'm a DBT therapist. So it's about building a life worth living. And ultimately, you know, the highest order of a life worth living for us might be a lifetime partner who shares all of my kinks. If we accept that that's going to be really difficult, what are we going to do in the meantime? With ourselves, for ourselves, you know, we're all here having a great day, which is nice, but that's where trust starts. Trust starts in that relationship you have with you. And I really, really believe that. I hope I've answered some questions about relationships, about dynamics. Again, the same as the HMP workshop. If anybody's got anything they want to ask me, any questions they didn't feel like they wanted to, you know, put their hand up and ask in this forum, or they're a little bit more personal and confidential, I'm more than happy for people to come and find me. But it's not about trust and it's not about relationships, it's general. That's okay too. I'm more than happy to take any questions until, when I was off, till 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock this evening, I'm going to be enjoying myself, and that's my personal boundary for me. I'm going to be having a nice time. I'm going to be until 7 o'clock. If anybody wants to find me for anything, please do.
Thank you very much.